We now welcome Andy No, who has a brand new book out about all of this. It's called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And we welcome him to the show via Skype. Andy, it's good to see you, and congrats on the book.
Thank you for having me on.
Of course. You have been around the country. You've documented what's been happening with Antifa for several years now, and I think perhaps more so than anyone else who is in media, legacy media or new media. And at first, when these accusations about Antifa and what their overall goal was, when these accusations were first made several years ago, right when I guess that name began to become popularized, people they didn't really take it seriously. The accusations that, well, this actually is kind of, for the lack of a better way to put it, a sort of street team for the radical left and a way to destabilize certain areas and maybe largely overall the country. Well, now here we are, fast forward 2021, and it really does seem that has actually worked, and they've been able to do that with little to zero condemnation from a lot of elected officials. Tell me about how you got what drew you to covering Antifa in the first place, because you've been attacked, you've been hospitalized, you've really gone through a lot to bring this book to fruition.
Portland is my hometown, and going back several years now, I've been witnessing political violence become routine and banal there, to the point of where the local journalists were just treating it as just another weekend. But the issues that I was witnessing was that the people who, if they were arrested, they were being let out, they were having their charges dropped, and the condemnation that you would expect from elected officials to those who are engaging in brawls on the streets and property destructions. It didn't actually come because Antifa, like BLM, claimed to be fighting against fascism and fighting for racial justice. So just based on that, this movement has been allowed to grow. And I lamented part of the book writing process, seeing that the warnings that I had from several years ago were beginning to bear out. And actually, I had underestimated them. I didn't think that in 2020, they could, in some major American cities, actually claim territory. Now, that sounds like an exaggeration, but rewind back to last summer, they claimed an area of Seattle, six square blocks, for more than 3 weeks. And that led to multiple homicides, shootings. They claim territory in Portland, and all of these issues that have allowed sort of the ground to be paved for Antifa. These issues are still going to remain with us even as we get a new administration that is Democrat. And in fact, given things that Kamala has done, such as tweeting out a crowdfunding link for those accused of heinous crimes at riots in Minnesota, it wouldn't be surprising if these people feel emboldened in that they have now an ally in the executive office.
Yes, and that's a really good point that you bring up. We're speaking with Andy No over his new book, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, which is available now at booksellers everywhere. Do you think that certain elected officials, how did this start with this seeming sanction of this violence? Was it because they were just afraid of these individuals right off the bat and they thought that the best way to maybe control them was to befriend them? Or do they actually share, you think, these beliefs that violence is a tactic and is an acceptable solution?
I think establishment Democrats, by and large, probably would not share the same views if they actually knew what the anarchist communists of Antifa actually believe, which is for violent revolution against the American government and overthrowing free markets and creating autonomous communes around the country that are communist. But most people don't dig deep into this ideology. In fact, they don't even think Antifa is a real thing. Antifa has been given coverage day in and day out for years now by the mainstream media. So nobody recognizes them actually really as a threat. And even when they do now, like belatedly in the case of Portland with the mayor having been assaulted just last week by some of these extremists who have been arrested at the riots, it's almost too late. It's like the prosecutor who has been elected, promising restorative justice, has already laid out policies that essentially decriminalize rioting. You see the same thing in Seattle, in San Francisco, in just the overall. I mean, the main victory of Antifa, I would say, is that they've been able to mainstream tenets of their ideology right in front of us without most people realizing. And I would say that the main thing is that it's become a mainstream position on the left that you solve your political grievances through violence. I mean, they think it's appropriate to punch and hit people and even destroy property over their political grievances. I mean, it's a meme now when they say that people over property.
Yeah, and that's so sad. We've seen, and I'll ask you about that as well, because you've suffered at the hands of, you've been dealt some of that violence. You brought up a really good point talking to Andy No about his book Unmasked. When you mentioned the mainstreaming of some of these tenets, because Antifa and, for instance, Black Lives Matter, for a while it was, and it still in some ways seems like this. It's not so much that they're intertwined, but it does seem like you have Black Lives Matter, a loosely affiliated in some ways, but national kind of protest and group, except when the riots happen. But Antifa was able, especially in Minneapolis and elsewhere, to take some of, the defunding of police. Some of the calls for defunding of police were the loudest in Portland and Seattle, where these issues didn't happen. It wasn't Minneapolis and it wasn't Nashville. It was in Portland and Seattle, and that's where you saw the most action on it.
Yes, great insight. You notice that they take issues that really have no relevance to them locally and then apply it to a larger agenda. I mean, the stated goal is to abolish police because the police literally are those who are enforcing the rule, enforcing or being one part of enforcing the rule of law, and that's what they want to get rid of. They call for the abolishment of law enforcement of the American criminal justice system, so that they saw sort of an example in with the death of George Floyd as a story to exploit very cruelly, actually. And unfortunately, with the aid of media, this became a global movement. I mean, in places that had nothing, that have entirely different race history of race, like for example in Britain, that BLM message of anti-police was also mainstream there. So it's a very dangerous, I would say, coalition between BLM and Antifa, in that you have essentially far left radicals who are openly Marxists and anarchists who want to destabilize the United States, and they're doing it plainly within the mainstream.
Yeah, definitely. We're speaking with Andy No, whose new book Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy is actually, it's on sale February 2nd. I'll correct my comments there. It's on sale February 2nd, but you can pre-order now. Because everything that we saw last week, there was the protest, and then people broke off from that protest, and there was a violent riot in the Capitol that I think has been universally condemned. Are there chances, because I've read so far 3 separate pieces, Andy, just today, discussing the upcoming inauguration and plans around the country of different protests, and how some are warning, don't go to these protests because there are radical elements like Antifa who may seize upon them to use that as, a way to agitate. Is there any truth to that? Are they widespread enough to actually attempt something like that? Do you think that these are maybe verifiable, like valid warnings that are being given by some?
I think given how inflammatory the entire political scene has been in the US in the past week, for me, it seems like it would be good advice to be avoiding large political rallies at this moment. However, with that said, I can't personally verify any of these claims of organized Antifa intending to infiltrate conservative protests or whatever. I will. With that said, I think it's important to say that there has been at least one person that I independently verified, as well as the press did as well, who was a BLM radical from Utah who was at least in the Capitol during the siege last week. His name is John Sullivan. He was arrested and charged last year over a BLM Antifa riot in Utah that resulted in a shooting. So That he was there, I think, is, I mean, it remains to be seen how significant that is, but we shouldn't. I think what I take away though from this overall response to the Capitol Hill siege, which, as you said, has been universally condemned rightfully, is that my question is, where were the people who are loudest now? Where were they last year when in Portland, my city, the one of the largest cities in the Pacific Northwest, when week after week after week, thousands of rioters actually tried to burn down the federal courthouse in downtown. They came with explosives, they came with power tools, they came with rope, and they actually did breach the barriers. And the federal officers from DHS who were sent there to protect that property, they were demonized as Trump's Gestapo and secret police. So, the cries now, they ring hollow to me, and actually they infuriate me, because these people, politicians on the left, they can't say they're for political violence if they're only willing to condemn it when it's on the other side.
I think that's a very good point. I think that inconsistency is what unsettles a lot of people around the country who would like to see everybody kind of come together and just let's condemn all of the violence as some sort of acceptable form of speech, because it shouldn't be it should not be considered that way for sure. Speaking with Andy Ngo, new book Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. I'll ask you this, Andy, and I appreciate your time with us today. I saw the video. I've seen video where you've been attacked, and I've seen the photos of the aftermath. And I mean, this is, I mean, you've been beaten up. You've had a concussion. You've been in the hospital. You've been beaten about the head to where your eye was almost swollen shut. I saw one video where these rioters were dumping things on you, and you weren't there. And I want to make sure that I tell everyone, you don't go there as an agitator. You do not make yourself part of the story. You're one of the very few individuals that is legitimately devoted to just simply telling the story of what is happening in their community. And you try not to editorialize that. And I think you do a very good job of it. And yet you are treated so heinously by people who get together and they do these public acts of violence, and yet they get mad when people show them that they're in the public doing these acts of violence. Tell me what your life has been like simply just covering this, because from what I've seen, you've been through quite a lot. How are you physically? You look like you've recovered mostly from everything that has happened so far, but tell me how it's been for you and the trouble just to get to this point with this story.
Yeah, the beating that happened the summer of 2019 actually resulted in me having a brain hemorrhage. So I had a brain injury that required about a year of various forms of therapies through the local hospital for me to be healed. When I think about that, my sadness and frustration is that nobody's been held accountable. We're more than a year out from that vicious attack, and not a single person has been arrested, much less charged, and I doubt they will be. So that's the reality of living in Portland. I know there was a lot of mockery when the DOJ described in a statement that in some areas of the U.S., these are essentially anarchist jurisdictions. And I don't think that was an overstatement or hyperbole. You do see the breakdown of the rule of law. You see that people who are arrested literally 6, 7, 8, 9 times at riots, they have all their charges immediately dropped. And people can assault and beat other citizens within eye of a police station, and nothing's done. My story is not unique. I've been fortunate that people know about what happened to me and that I have a platform. But every American is at risk because of this violent extremist movement that is given mainstream legitimacy.
And Andy, I would say that you say that your story isn't unique, but I think that we are uniquely informed about Antifa because of your work, and that definitely is unique. And so we are grateful for that. And of course, as we started this discussion with you, now they're trying to cancel you, which hopefully enough people will speak out against this cancel culture to prevent legitimate reporting from being silenced. Andy Ngo, the new book, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Again, congratulations on the book. I've ordered it, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. Andy, thank you so much.